Hello, and welcome to the Field Guides. I'm Steve, and I'm not here with Bill, but I'm actually not in this episode, so that's fine. Today, we're bringing you a bonus episode where Bill interviews Gordon Maupin, a general naturalist, but more notably, the former director of the Wilderness Center in northeastern Ohio, and along with Joann Ballbach and Gary Popotnik, the former host of Wild Ideas, the podcast. And before you get too used to stereo sound in your headphones, let me switch over to my cell phone because Bill forgot the memory card for our nice mic and the entire interview is recorded with his phone. Okay, that's worse. So Wild Ideas was and is an excellent resource for information on natural history. And it was definitely a strong influence on Bill's and my decision to start our own podcast after it ended in November 2014, which was less than a year before we released the first episode of the Field Guides. Bill will mention it briefly, but if you're interested in listening to Wild Ideas, I'll have a link in the episode notes to a page where you can listen to 12 episodes for free or pay $20 for the entire back catalog of 285 episodes. So I highly suggest that you give Wild Ideas the podcast a listen to at some point in the near future, but for now, I think I'll stop talking and let you listen to Bill's conversation with Gordon Maupin.
Test.
Looks like you're good.
Yep. Looks good.
Yep.
Okay. Hello and welcome to the Field Guides. I'm Bill and I am not here with Steve today. I am actually outside our usual area. I am in Ohio and I have a special guest tonight, Gordon Maupin, naturalist extraordinaire and former co-host of the Wild Ideas podcast, which we had mentioned previously here on the Field Guides. So, good evening, Gordon.
Hey, great to be here.
And I want to start out by saying thank you for giving up a beautiful June Sunday evening to spend some time talking to me.
Oh, not a problem. I enjoy talking nature whenever I get a chance.
All right, so folks, for those of you that don't know, Gordon was the co-host, as I mentioned, of a podcast called Wild Ideas, and that podcast was really one of my inspirations for starting up the Field Guides. I had listened to Wild Ideas for really almost as long as you'd been recording it, and when you guys retired, a void was left in my life. And I had been tossing around the idea of doing a podcast for a while. Gordon, I don't know if I'd mentioned, I'd been a naturalist previously at the Beaver Meadow Audubon Center.
Okay.
I left that to become a classroom teacher, but still was volunteering out at Beaver Meadow, do birding, doing nature hikes when I can, guided hikes. And I just felt like that would be a good way to keep my feet into the natural history waters, was to do my own podcast. And I met my co-host, Steve, through bird banding out at Beaver Meadow Audubon Center. And it turned out he was having a similar idea as well. He had been a fan of the podcast. So can you give people an idea just of what Wild Ideas was?
Well, what I'd say, Wild Ideas, the podcast, was sort of my brainchild.
Oh, okay.
From listening to other podcasts and realizing, well, heck, I can do that, you know. And we ran it for like 5 years. The Wilderness Center was the organization. I was the executive director of the Wilderness Center before retiring. And we ran that probably 5 years, once a week for 5 years. I mean, we had several hundred episodes.
All right, that's impressive. You did it every week.
Yeah, it was quite a, it was a horse you had to get on and ride when we started doing it. But Gary and Joann and I really enjoyed doing it.
And Gary was a conservation biologist.
Gary's a conservation biologist. Joann was a science educator, but obviously a very nature-oriented science person.
Did she work at the Wilderness Center?
Yeah. She was my education director there.
Okay.
And Gary was my land stewardship director.
Okay.
And I was the executive director. And I my master's degree is in botany, field botany. But I was always a general naturalist. I guess too short an attention span,
Right.
So I was listening to your Flying Squirrel podcast. I'm pretty sure we talked flying squirrels at some point on Wild Ideas.
Yeah.
And so I took the role of, as the general naturalist. And when we started Wild Ideas, there's a few things we said. We said we were going to stick closely to the science.
Good.
And that was very important to us. And that we would always speak of evolution as a fact, because, duh, it is.
Right.
And that we also would, wanted to let our passion for the natural world show, which we did.
Oh, definitely. You definitely.
And so the format we used with Wild Ideas is that Gary, Joann, and I, the first half of the show, it usually ran around an hour. The first half we would just some random nature thing.
Each of you brought in a different topic.
Yeah, each of us would bring in a different topic of some random thing, that we noticed, which actually inspired us to observe nature more closely.
Right.
Because we had to come up with something every week, and we would do, some quick and dirty research on it because we're not doing a scientific treatise.
Right.
We're giving people basic facts and communicating a passion.
Doing something for the layperson.
Yeah. And so we would do our 3 topics, and then we would have either an interview or we would pick one of the 3 things and explore it in greater depth. And so the second part was either an interview or a more in-depth, something that one of the first 3 topics, begged for a little more in-depth discussion.
Right,
so it was one or the other for the second part of the podcast.
Now, did you right away come up with the idea of all 3 of you doing it?
Yes, it was important. It worked out great because Gary, Joann, and I were pretty good foils for one another.
Okay, and you knew them well. So.
It was terrific to have Joann because it was good to have a female voice.
Sure.
To counteract the 2 male voices.
Yeah, we don't have that on the field, guys.
And then Joann is the educator. Gary and I would occasionally wander into the weeds of technical biology or whatever, and Joann would make us define our terms and that not let us get too technical.
And I feel I do that with Steve.
Yeah.
That I'm the one who's in the classroom. I teach 2nd grade. Chiefly, but I also teach 1 night a week at the university near Buffalo. So I'm always thinking, how can we make this as accessible as possible? So I'm very often stopping him and saying, what does that mean? Tell people what that means again.
Yeah, and what I would say is people can go to the Wilderness Center website.
Right.
And they keep a few. It's really expensive, and the Wilderness Center is a nature center, so it's broke always. And but they keep some episodes up on the website. You kind of have to hunt around a little bit, but you can find some websites. And I believe that if somebody wanted the whole stuff for a fee, they would.
We actually found this out.
Okay.
Because a couple months ago, me just doing something quick, I posted on our Facebook page, hey, if you haven't listened to Wild Ideas, the podcast, go back and check it out. It was one of the inspirations for our podcast. And I posted it. And I think I posted the iTunes page.
Oh, yeah,
But then we've quickly found out from people trying to do that, the episodes aren't there anymore.
Yeah.
So someone found out that if you contact the Wilderness Center, they will send you all of the episodes for $20 on a flash drive.
All of them. Wow.
All of them.
So. Oh, wow. I'll have to go give them my $20. Recover all those episodes.
That's what was reported to us by our fans. So, folks, I would say to listeners out there, if you haven't listened to Wild Ideas, turn this episode off and go track down some episodes of Wild Ideas, because it really is fantastic. And, I was thinking on the way down here, it really influenced me because coming up as I did, just the people that I talked to, I came up with a naturalist training that was based a lot in folklore, in ethnobotany. Mm-hmm. It didn't have a hard science background. And when I started listening to your podcast, there was one episode that sticks out in my mind. It was one where homeopathy came up.
Uh-huh.
And listening to you talk, I could tell you had very little patience for homeopathy. And I don't mean that in a negative way. You just say, let's call it what it is. It's a pseudoscience.
Yes.
And you just presented it so matter-of-factly, where people in my background that I respected, and their opinion respected, who did use homeopathy, that really made me stop and think and say, whoa, here's someone whose opinion I greatly respect. I didn't know you personally at the time, but that made me start to question more. I had already started to question some things that I had just always kind of accepted as truth. being in natural history and education, there's a lot of things that people present as fact.
Sure.
I'm sure you come across. Daddy longlegs are the most poisonous
Sure.
spiders you're going to come across.
Right, yeah.
And many people don't like being disabused of these notions.
Toads cause warts. Yeah.
Right, like a lot of those
Yeah,
things.
right.
And that really opened my eyes in a good way. I was meeting people and hanging around people that had a much more skeptical viewpoint. And I would say you helped set my feet more firmly on that path. And, I had started teaching at the university then, so I had to do a lot more homework. I was teaching an Intro to Environmental Studies class.
Uh-huh.
So I had to do a lot more of teaching myself about just the basics of ecology and biology and
Sure.
evolution.
Sure.
And what is a theory when you're speaking of it scientifically, not in the colloquial sense? The theory of evolution is accepted fact, because in science a theory is something that is backed up by...
Well, the evolution is both a theory and a fact. It's a fact that it happened.
Correct.
And still happens.
Right.
It never stops happening. That is a fact. And then a theory is, well, how does it work? And then how can you use it to make predictions about the natural world?
Right. And science really has to call it a theory, though, because science is really, in one sense, waiting for someone to disprove it.
Sure. And as soon as someone comes up with something better, I'll have to say, well, look at the evidence. I think that's pretty unlikely.
Right.
But should someone come up with something better?
Right. Well, I think there's a good spot also to tell people that this particular episode, it's going to be a bonus episode for us, and it's going to be a different format, obviously, more of an interview. Steve and I had been tossing around the idea of doing bonus episodes where we sat down with naturalists, people in science, people that we respect, and just give them a chance to talk to us and tell some stories. This started back with our Christmas bird count episode, which some of our listeners may have heard, where one of the people that was part of my naturalist training, he gave me my first job as a naturalist, David Junkin. We went to his house during our Christmas bird count. He has an incredible bird feeder set up.
Sure.
And after tramping on trails for hours in the cold, we go to Dave's and sit down, and he gives us coffee, and he even has his bird feeders mic'd. So as we sit inside, we can listen to the birds and quickly up our list in the comfort of his home. But he told us just, through talking, lots of great stories, and that really inspired Steve and I to do this. So I was heading down here to Cleveland with my family, and I knew you were in the general area of Cleveland, and I sent Gordon an email, kind of a shot in the dark, and I was amazed how fast you got back to me. I actually called Steve right up and said, "You're not going to believe this." Gordon got right back to me. I think this is going to happen. So again, I appreciate you doing this, but I think a good way to get the more conversational part of the interview going is, what can you remember as like your first experience in nature?
I think I was a child of nature from
the beginning.
From the diapers, anyway.
Was there an adult in your life that?
Yeah, my dad was sort of an outdoorsman, but certainly not educated in it, and he was a hunter and a fisherman.
Sure.
And he liked the outdoors and being active outdoors, but he was certainly not educated in natural sciences. But I think for me, and it goes back to some episodes we talked about in Wild Ideas, interviews with Ken Finch, it really goes back to early childhood.
Right.
Really early childhood. And, I have memories of before I was in school of wading in creeks.
You were a creek rat.
And
me too.
And I have this childhood memory, and I must have been in like first grade, and I know that I couldn't tell time. But I know, as a kid, I just have this memory of being in class and knowing that school was going to be out, and there was a drainage ditch where I could go. I waded up and down and caught crawdads, crayfish,
right.
And in this drainage ditch, and that was my recreation, was doing that. And my dad, grew up and worked in corporate America, and he was transferred, and we would always when every few years he would be transferred to another place, and we would go and cities were expanding real big, and we would my parents would buy a house in the new developments, which happened to be where the farmers had been bought out and the developers were putting up houses, and there was always land where the houses hadn't been built yet. So it was wild land that wasn't a park, where nobody was telling you couldn't do things. And so, me and other neighborhood kids and everything, that's where we played.
Sure. That's where you had your adventures.
We had our adventures there. And always it was, building forts or wading up and down creeks or climbing trees or doing other things that we would be appalled at people. Nowadays,
all these unsafe things, right?
Yeah, all these unsafe things that we would be appalled nowadays,
Right.
And there wasn't all the boogeyman fears. Parents had kids on a longer leash.
Sure.
I got in trouble more for not getting home for dinner.
Right.
Than anything. That was probably the number one thing I got in trouble for.
Sure.
I was out doing serious playing.
And probably some stuff that you could have gotten in trouble for if they had known, right?
Yeah, probably. On more than one occasion.
Sure. No, I did the same thing.
So that was clearly my earliest exposure to the natural world, and it is amazing when you get in at a conference or something with other naturalists, people that are professionals in natural sciences, how many of them have similar childhood experiences.
Right.
And that was a theme that we came back to over and over in Wild Ideas, the podcast, was the importance of going out and playing.
Right.
For young kids to go out and play. And for many, many years in the natural science education field, we had things backwards. We thought, if people attend our classes and listen to our lessons, they'll learn to love the natural world. That's backwards. People love the natural world, and then they're inspired to learn the science. And the love of the natural world comes very early by frequent positive experiences with nature, to quote my friend Ken Finn.
And Gary used to end every episode by telling people to get their kids outside.
That was very deliberate.
Sure.
That was very deliberate on our part, was to remind people the importance of getting outside.
So should we pick up that torch?
You should. You absolutely should. It's important.
I agree.
It is really important that people let their kids, encourage their kids to go out, get wet, get muddy,
get dirty.
Get dirty.
No, because
that's actually healthy. We probably did an episode on the hygiene hypothesis. Actually, getting dirty is
good for your immune system.
It is. It is.
And I don't know how much it's hit here yet in Ohio, but in Western New York, within the past few years, ticks have really started to spread, and you would not believe the hysteria that is coming, riding that wave of people really being afraid to send their kids outside.
Yeah, we did an episode on ticks.
We did.
And talked to the tick guy. You can treat clothing for ticks, and it will survive multiple washes. That's something you can deal with. I was always real arrogant about ticks because I spent a lot of my younger years in the Ozarks, which were ticks are everywhere. I can remember one of my first jobs leading nature walks. I'd lead my nature walk on a little loop trail with a bunch of people, and I would go back in and pull 4 or 5 ticks off.
Sure. It was just part of the routine.
It was just part of but Lyme disease wasn't an issue then.
Right.
And Rocky Mountain spotted fever was pretty rare then, so there weren't the diseases to be concerned about. So I definitely advise people to go to the Tick Encounter website and get the stuff and treat a set of play clothes. So
we my class just had a field trip near the end of the year. We went to a local nature center, and we did find after the hike a few ticks on several kids. So thankfully, the year prior to that, our principal had actually canceled some field trips because of fear
Yeah.
of ticks.
Well, irrational fear
Right.
seems to be the rule of the day.
Yeah, my daughter, who was in kindergarten 2 years ago, she actually brought home from her school a 5-page printout that they had sent home with every child with a huge headline saying, Lyme disease is the epidemic of our time. And page after page of this hysterical stuff that you could tell was just cut and pasted off the internet.
Yeah.
It was just very disappointing to see.
Yeah.
So, but we did an episode on ticks for that very reason, because we wanted to say this is what to be concerned about, this is what to do about it, but don't let it stop you from going outside.
Yeah. It's not a reason, and I think the hysteria is a little bit overblown. But
it's something to be concerned about.
Yeah.
Sure.
Take the countermeasures.
Just like when you get in the car and go driving someplace,
Yeah.
be concerned about safety.
Yeah. Put a lightning rod on the barn.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
So why don't we talk a little bit now? So you gave us a little bit of background on, how you developed your love of nature. How did that translate into a career? What's the story behind that?
Well, like most kids, graduate from in high school, I took all the biology I could. I took an advanced biology course and everything, and decided when I went to college I'd major in biology. But my goal was to work in the outdoors somehow, and so that's what I did. Is I got a biology major at the Missouri State University, and then went on to get a master's. But I took a wide variety of courses, both in zoology and botany, to have a balanced background. If the course interested me, I took it. I took ichthyology, although I never did much with that. But I took ornithology, took plant taxonomy. I took courses that were the natural world. And then I was very fortunate. I had a friend that I was rooming with at the time that he had managed to get a seasonal naturalist job with a state park, and he told me how to go about doing that. And so I managed to get a seasonal naturalist job at a Missouri State Park.
Nice.
And I did that for 3 summers as a seasonal naturalist.
During college?
Yeah, during college.
Nice.
And even I did my research for my master's on that park, on the flora of that park. And so I was able to combine, getting the master's degree with getting the with a job that paid really poorly, but
sure,
but who cares,
Were you doing interpretation then, teaching?
Yes, I was doing interpretation as an interpretive naturalist, a seasonal naturalist, and so I did nature hikes and.
Had you ever led hikes before?
No, and I got no training whatsoever. At that
anybody
time.
can do it, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, and I was pretty lousy the first year.
Like we all were, yeah.
Yeah, I was pretty rotten, and but it, improved.
Right.
Of course, I was learning a whole lot more. When I was doing the flora of that park, and so between nature walks, I was out exploring the park, and every night I was in the place where I was living. I had a dissecting scope there and was keying out plants.
Wow.
And so it was and this park was remote. You couldn't hardly even get a radio station, and so I was able to do my work.
You're like Ed Abbey in the Arches, right?
A little bit, yeah, a little bit. It was great. It was really, and there was no distractions from doing my work because there wasn't anything else to do.
Wow. So
that was a great experience. And then, as I was finishing up the masters, my professors, oh man, they wanted me to go get a PhD. I mean, that's what they knew. They were college professors.
Sure.
That's what they knew. But for some reason, I knew that wasn't my calling.
Oh.
To be a PhD research guy. I really liked communicating to people about nature from this naturalist job. I liked that. And so when I finished my master's, it was a downtime in the economy. There were precious few jobs.
So when was this, if I can ask?
Oh, this would have been 76, 75, 76.
Okay.
It was in this time, and so I decided I would go get a second master's in journalism.
Oh, wow.
At the University of Missouri, which is a premier journalism school.
Why journalism?
Science writing.
Oh, okay.
And that I thought, if I could become a science journalist, I'd, be communicating nature. But I went there and I was not a good student in journalism because I was suddenly now, I'd been a grad student, now I was taking undergrad courses, and my heart wasn't really in some of that. And so I would do a semester of journalism school and not like it that much. And then I had an old boss with the state parks that would call me up for temporary jobs as a naturalist. So I'd do a semester, and then I'd go do a job for a semester, and then I'd come back to journalism school. But the great thing about the University of Missouri is it had a fabulous jobs board. And I knew I needed to get out of school.
And when you say board, you mean like an actual physical board?
Yeah, this is ancient times. And so I started going and checking they'd have physical paper postings on a bulletin board, and I would be checking that every day. And one day I went there in a job as an outdoor writer photographer for the Oklahoma Wildlife Department. And so I applied for that job and got it.
Wow! Did you have background in photography?
Yeah, that was when I went to college. Here again, this is the nature kid, the outdoor guy, and one thing about a good-sized university is there's all these extracurricular activities, and there was a cave exploring club there. It was called Heart of the Ozarks Grotto, HOG for short. And their logo was a big old razorback, because it was, Missouri Ozarks,
Sure.
And so I joined HOG and went on my weekends and that sort of thing. Did a lot of cave exploring and mapped caves, went into vertical caves. It was adventure.
Wow.
And it was the outdoors, even though you were inside a cave.
Right.
And did a lot of cave exploring type stuff, both recreationally, and then the club was sponsored by the geology department there, so I took quite a lot of geology. Not enough to call myself a geologist, but quite a lot of geology, which was terrific background.
Sure.
In addition to the biology, to have this the solid background in geology that I got from being active in the caving club and then taking some courses along that line. And so one of the things when you go into caves, certain caves are just spectacularly beautiful. And so there were people in that caving club that were photographers, and it can be a very complicated process to photograph a cave because it's dark. It's dark.
Not a lot of light. Yeah.
Not a lot of light. And so sometimes I would assist photographers that were trying to get photographs in caves, that showed the natural beauty of the cave. And so I pretty much then, got a camera, a good camera, and taught myself photography. So I was self-taught on that, but I became a pretty good photographer.
Now, did you go all the way at that time with developing yourself?
No,
Okay.
I never. I shot slides mostly. I did a little bit on the side, some darkroom, black and white darkroom work. That was real common back then.
Yeah.
This is pre-digital
Right.
photography, all chemical photography.
I remember.
Yeah, and so so I did learn photography, and so then when I got that job in Oklahoma, I was writing for Outdoor Oklahoma magazine, which was a hunting and fishing magazine.
Okay.
I mean, that was really the state wildlife departments are.
Sure, we have one in New York, the Conservationist.
Especially at that period, they were fish and game.
Right,
Hardcore fish and game outfits. But I was receptive to that and could do some stuff.
Sure.
And so that was like my first real job, and I was there really a relatively short time, and then people I knew in Missouri the Missouri Department of Conservation had passed a sales tax to support conservation, a 1/8 of 1 cent sales tax in the state of Missouri to support conservation, forestry, fisheries, wildlife. And so I had a lot of contacts back there, and they notified me of a job to be the naturalist program coordinator there.
Oh, wow.
And so I was hired to be what they called the naturalist program coordinator in Missouri. And while I was doing that, I actually wrote a plan for Missouri to build nature centers with the proceeds from that sales tax, which they ultimately did.
As part of the coordinator job?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
I wrote this plan, and part of that I toured a lot of nature centers, and interviewed the staff and everything else. And the nonprofit nature centers were, to me, that was where it was at. And that job, even though it sounds like a cool job, it was the job from hell. It was literally the job from hell.
Why?
Because they had lumped all the non-game, the endangered species, the natural areas, and they threw me in with this group as well, of all the non-traditional stuff that they'd promised the public. And the hardcore fish and game guys were terribly, terribly threatened by, what's this guy preserving endangered species? What are these natural areas? There are cancer spreading over. One guy actually literally called natural areas a cancer spreading over the land.
Places where they couldn't hunt and fish, or no?
No, they were just
state run.
They were just not traditional fish and game.
Okay.
And they were terribly threatened. I think they became more enlightened as time went on, but they, initially it was so outside the traditional hunting and fishing paradigm for a state fish and game agency that
sure
it
seemed foreign.
Yeah, it was foreign, and it was threatening. Because they were always threatening because there has always been some anti-hunters out.
Sure.
And of course, none of us were anti-hunting. We have a biologist view of the natural world, and anyway, so that job was not pleasant.
How old were you?
I was in my late 20s to the early 30s, young. So anyway, I then moved on and got hired by the Wilderness Center as an executive director, and I quickly went from being a naturalist. They hired me because I was a good naturalist, but the last thing they needed was a naturalist. They needed a nonprofit administrator.
Now, did you know that at the time?
I didn't know it at the time, but I realized it fairly quickly, and I rose to the challenge. And so then I administered the organization. And that was what was so great about Wild Ideas, is instead of just fundraising and organizational management and all that sort of stuff, when we started Wild Ideas, the podcast, then I could be a naturalist.
You could feel like a naturalist.
I could be a naturalist again. I kept up with the field. I never let the science get too far ahead of me.
Sure.
I didn't read a lot of technical papers, but I kept up with it in a lot of different ways, books and that sort of thing.
So, from the time you became director or executive director of the Wilderness Center,
right?
How many years passed before you started Wild Ideas? A lot, right?
A lot, but it was a small nature center at the time. There was just a few employees when I started there, and so even though I was the executive director, you were a jack of all trades,
right?
And so I did a fair amount of educational stuff, and my orientation was more doing programming that is more on an adult level.
Okay.
Than the small kids,
which is a different animal.
Which is a different animal, and that was what.
No pun intended.
Well, that's what that's what the organization needed at the time, was to involve adults, because adults make the donations.
Financial distress.
Yeah, they make the donation. So it was really I worked really hard to get adults involved.
Right.
And so then, as it became more successful, I got pushed more and more into the back office, and
we need other people doing programs.
And so then, when podcasting became
a thing,
right on your desktop, anybody could do it. Then started listening to a few. I was listening to science podcasts, and realized that, gee, I can do that.
Yeah, right.
And Joann and Gary were open. Of course, I was their boss, so they didn't have a choice to be. But no, they were very.
They were voluntold.
Yeah, they were voluntold. Yeah, but they were happy to do it.
Sure.
And enjoyed doing it.
We could tell.
Yeah, I mean.
And I was going to say, if many years, decades, in fact, had passed from the time you were hired until the time you started doing Wild Ideas.
Yeah.
I had the sense that you had been teaching nature programs right along. Like, it didn't seem to me as a listener that you had spent any amount of time away from interacting with the public as an educator. So.
No, I always had.
Good.
But when we were doing Wild Ideas, I told Gary and Joann, and I told the people we were interviewing that when we're interviewing somebody or when we're talking, I want the listener to be at the table with us. They're our friends. They just don't say much, and we're all having a beer together, and we're talking about nature.
Right.
And I wanted that friendly warmth like we're having right now.
Right.
I wanted that friendly warmth to come across in the podcast, and for the most part, it did.
I think so.
Once in a while, you would get somebody you would interview that just never, they were used to lecturing to classrooms, and, but generally, I wanted that warmth.
Right. And honestly, that's what happened with the field guides was kind of the germ, because our friend Matt Candeas, he does a podcast called In Defense of Plants,
Mm-hmm.
which is, for the most part, an interview show.
Right.
But when it started, Steve did a few episodes with him, and Matt did a few episodes where he just recorded taking a hike with friends.
Uh-huh.
And for Steve and I, those were some of our favorite episodes.
Right.
Where it was just like, this is like when we go out as friends and go on a nature hike and we're making stupid jokes and we're, just trying to make each other laugh while we're learning together with field guides. So that was the germ of the idea. There was this vacuum we felt left with Wild Ideas being gone. And we said, we're always going hiking. Why don't we just record ourselves, pick a topic and see what happens?
Yeah.
And really, when we started, we didn't think anyone would listen. And we really still have no idea how many people are listening, but I know exactly what you mean.
Wild Ideas, we were getting 100,000 downloads a year.
Wow!
By the time I retired.
Yeah, we went out on a high note, like Seinfeld.
Yeah, I guess. Probably if I'd had a budget to market it, we probably could have had millions. I really do feel that.
I think so too.
I had no budget to market it.
It was just a labor of love.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when you decided to retire, can I ask how come you didn't keep doing? You just wanted to get off that treadmill, or?
Well, getting up in years, and I had been very ambitious not for myself, but for the success of the Wilderness Center.
Sure.
And I saw that ambition waning, and circumstances came, like Joann, Gary, and me, and several other people in the staff. We were all kind of the same age.
Okay.
And I was just a year or two older than, and I was into my 60s, and I'm thinking, I need to be the first one to go, so that the new guy, the new executive director, can come in and will have an opportunity to name his own team through retirements.
Sure.
That were inevitable. The train was rolling down the tracks. So my ambition wasn't what it once was. To pour the effort in it takes to run a nonprofit.
Right.
And then looking to the future of the organization, and I just really realized that it was time.
Right.
And so I retired, and I missed doing Wild Ideas. I really did miss doing it. I sure didn't miss the long hours of post-production.
It takes a long time.
And we divvied up post-production. We took turns doing the post-production on the episodes.
So can I just ask, how long would it take to edit an episode for you guys?
For us, usually I would come home. I mean, I didn't do it at work because work was busy and you need uninterrupted time. And it would take a few hours at least for full post-production and get it uploaded and everything.
Right.
At least. Because, you got an hour long and you've got to edit all the
Right.
You edit all this stuff out and then we would put a layer of natural sounds in the background and try to make it.
It takes a long time.
And assemble the pieces, and so it takes hours. And
It
so
does.
I would do it till late at night. My wife would go to bed, and then I'd start editing.
It takes us, I would say, an average of 5 to 6. It takes me an average of 5 to 6 hours to edit an hour-long episode.
Right. Yeah. I think probably that's not unrealistic.
Right.
Sometimes you could do it a little bit faster. Depends on who you're interviewing.
Yes.
And what kind of gift of gab they have.
Definitely. All right, so you had previously mentioned that you had an idea that if people came to your nature center, you could instill a love of nature in them, but you felt they had that a little backwards.
Yeah.
That idea was a little backwards.
That idea was a little backwards.
Okay.
It was, I think, and this is really infused the nature education profession now, is the idea you need to really do what you can to get kids out at a young age.
Right. And I guess where I was going with that line of thinking is one of the reasons that I left the nature center game. I mean, there were a lot of reasons. I had done it about 10 years, so I did 2 or 3 years part-time and then 7 years full-time.
Yeah.
As at a very small nature center. And I got to say, during that time, I went to the Wilderness Center. You were hosting a conference, I think, for NAI. I think they're defunct now, the National Association of Interpretation. Or it could have been ANCA, maybe?
ANCA, probably.
So it's
Association of Nature Center Administrators. Yeah.
So I was there for an ANCA conference, and I was blown away. I actually, when I came back to our nature center, I sat down and wrote a list. 50 things that we can do to take Beaver Meadow to the next level, just because we were such a small center, and it's just where we were at the time.
Right.
But going to the Wilderness Center and seeing this sizable operation with things like an endowment and lots of volunteers and just lots of connections in the community. It was impressive to my young naturalist eyes who had been thrust into an administration position that I had no idea what I was doing.
Yeah.
It was a great way to learn. But after I'd done it for a while, and as you said, it requires a lot of ambition.
Yes.
And the annual wheel never stops.
No.
You roll from one busy season into another. But one of the things that I felt, and I would just be interested in getting your take on it, is I felt my job as a naturalist was to try to reach people who didn't have a deep relationship with nature, young or old, and to try to set them on that path, to pique their interest, to show them what was in their backyard. And very often at the nature center, I felt that the people that were coming already had that.
Yeah, the old preaching to the choir
Right, and
thing, yes.
part of me, and not all the time, but part of me felt, am I preaching to the choir? And I had someone, I talked to an old volunteer about this, who'd been doing it a long time, a great educator, and he said, Bill, if you take just one kid and change their mind, you'll have done your job. And I understood where he was coming from with that, but part of me said, if I spend all this time and I only change one mind,
You've done
no.
Yeah, right.
I'm like, no, I want to be doing something where I feel like I'm reaching a lot of minds. And that's one reason I went into the classroom, because I felt and that's one reason I went into elementary, is because I said, I can take these kids, I can do nature-themed things with them all the time, and kind of twist them to my thinking.
Yes.
You know.
Sure.
And I don't know. Like, part of me says, is that too cynical of you? I don't know. I mean, what's your take on? And
No. I think there was a time when people in nature education put themselves on this high pedestal. Our job is just to teach the facts, and then they will
drag and brag.
The
right?
passion will follow from everybody that listens to our grand voices, and and that we shouldn't advocate. That's beneath us to advocate. And no, we should be advocating for nature, and we should be telling people that it matters.
Right.
Because guess what?
And that evolution is really
the people that are out destroying nature have no problem advocating for their point of view.
true.
They have no qualms about that.
Right. And it feeds into our podcast as well, because I haven't talked to Steve about it a lot, but I have a struggle where I'm constantly almost self-editing or being aware of how I'm talking and the things I'm covering, because I don't want to make the podcast too technical. And in a certain sense, I always want to make the podcast more, lack of a better term, more goofy and more accessible for more people. Like,
Right.
I think to myself, my friends that aren't into nature, I want them to listen to this podcast.
Right.
Like, we did a Screech Owl episode where
Right.
I tricked Steve. I had another friend hiding in the woods playing a bobcat sound. We were out at night.
Uh-huh.
And I had a friend playing a bobcat sound, and Steve was seriously afraid. At one point, he went running and pulled the mic out of my hand, and we laughed. And, that to me was such a great episode. It was a Screech Owl episode.
Yeah.
We called some Screech Owls in. We talked about the natural history of Screech Owls, but I felt that's an episode I could tell anybody to listen to, and they would enjoy it. And when I used to teach volunteers at the Nature Center, they would be so afraid. I don't know every plant. I don't know every tree. And I would say, your job is to show kids a good time. It's not to identify everything with them. Because if they have a good time, then they're going to want to spend more time outside.
It's to communicate that passion.
Right.
The people pick up on the passion.
Right. And I think that's the heart of good teaching.
Yeah.
Is just to let that passion shine through.
Yes.
Yeah. But I think there's an art to it as well.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, well, I don't know, maybe a talent,
Right. But I think to an extent that can be learned, wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, to an extent.
We were
I gotta say, bobcat noise, that's great.
Yes.
If there's anything that'll scare your pants off, you would think the most horrible monster in the world.
You should listen just to the first 12 minutes of that episode,
I'll
because
have to go back and
he was so afraid. He's like, and it almost backfired because he didn't want to keep going.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he wanted to go back, and I kept, come on, let's just get closer. I don't want to get closer. He was seriously afraid.
they can make
Some frightening sounds, right?
Yeah.
But I'll probably cut this part out, but we were just at the Natural History Museum yesterday.
Uh-huh.
And we went to their planetarium.
Uh-huh.
And they showed a movie, and the movie was great, with Neil deGrasse Tyson talking about dark matter. But afterwards, they had a guy do like a 10-minute night sky show, and you could tell he had a gift.
Yeah.
He was just so easy with the crowd, like funny but casual, but presenting us, giving us solid information. And I went up to him after and just said, you have a gift. You have a gift for doing this. So.
Well, I would say one of the things I've had an avocation over the years as a storyteller.
Right.
And I was actually at one time considered becoming a professional storyteller.
Well, I could tell.
And didn't. It was probably a wise decision not to. But when I started getting interested in, how can I make talks more interesting? Mm-hmm. And this is kind of a long story, but I had a girlfriend at the time, and she said, well, we've got to go watch this guy on PBS. and the guy he was real popular in the 70s as a lecturer. He was called the Love Doctor. Of course, your girlfriend wants you to see this. and he was a psychologist that,
Who was it?
Leo Buscaglia.
Oh yeah,
And he
I remember his books.
Yeah, he was a real popular guy, and he was a noted speaker. And so I never would have watched this, but I had a girlfriend, and
Sure.
us guys do things, and so I was watching this guy, and at the time, I was doing nature talks and stuff, and was trying to figure out how to make them more interesting. And I was watching this guy talk about these relationships, and what the guy did, he was a storyteller.
Right.
He would tell us an anecdote. There'd maybe be a little bit of a lesson in the anecdote. He would string it into the next anecdote with some facts and information. But then he was off telling another story, and he mesmerized the audiences. And I looked at what he was doing, and then so whenever I gave nature programs, talks or whatever, and it went into the podcast as well.
Oh yeah.
Is if you can take your information and make it a story, people are wired to listen
Right.
to stories.
They're not only going to remember it better, they'll be inspired.
Yes.
Hopefully, they'll just be interested more.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be much.
Right. And that's like you just said before. It's not just about presenting facts.
Yeah.
And that's one thing that worries me with the podcast is sometimes I'm always aware I don't want to just be presenting facts.
Well, we were mentioning bobcat sounds.
Yeah.
If you just played the sounds of the bobcat and say, "Oh, this is a territorial," if you just did that, but if you say, "This is bobcat sounds," and my gosh, the first time I heard that, it scared my pants off.
Right.
And then you can talk about why is the bobcat making that noise.
Give them a hook.
But give them a hook. But acknowledge the wonder of those horrible sounds.
Right.
As a story.
And that's why I think I'm proud of that episode, because I think anyone who listens to that episode, they're going to remember what a bobcat sounds like.
Yeah.
So now I feel bad though we didn't talk more about the ecology of the bobcat sound, but it was a Screech Owl episode, so.
Yeah. No, that's fine.
Yeah.
What you want for the general public, they're not going to be biologists.
Right. We don't expect them to be.
What we want when they walk into the voting booth is to vote for nature.
Right.
That's what we want. And
especially these days, right?
Especially these days. We want them, we live in a democratic society, and public support for nature is the only thing that can save it.
Right. And as our culture, I'm sure you've seen it as you get older. I mean, even myself, I'm in my mid-40s, I've seen it. It's so easy to live a life completely separate from nature.
And the way in which even casual contact with nature can enrich people's lives.
Right.
And it will be a tragedy if we lose that as a society. It will be a tragedy. People will never know the pleasures they didn't have of hearing a bobcat sound.
Right.
And then telling their friends about getting their pants scared off by bobcat noises.
Right. So I think this is a good spot. One of the questions I wanted to ask was, through your long history as a naturalist, what is you, and this could be in the education realm or just in your personal experiences of hiking or birding or whatever, what is one of your most memorable nature experiences? And I know I'm putting you on the spot. So.
Yeah, that is. There's been, I've been blessed to have lots of great experience. The first time I heard a bobcat in nature and not knowing what it was at the time, it was like, my gosh.
So what was it doing at the time?
It was just these horrible growls, it just blood curdling.
Because I had someone tell me once that a bobcat can sound exactly like a woman screaming.
They can make a lot of sounds.
Now, have you heard that before?
No, I haven't heard that.
All right, because I've tried to look for that.
Yeah.
And I've never been able to find anything beyond, websites off the beaten path saying here's the sound of a bobcat. It sounds like a woman screaming.
Yeah.
But nothing quote unquote official.
Yeah.
So great story. But
You know, a lot of the great nature experiences I had, part of when I was at the Wilderness Center, part of what I did was lead eco tours
right.
to various places, and I did it to raise money for the Wilderness Center. You know, it was just like
but also to go see those places.
travel
right?
program. You know, really, I was real pragmatic about it. I went places where I thought I could get people to go.
Okay.
So.
It wasn't your personal travel.
No, it wasn't my personal travel agenda. Not at all. I was I needed to raise money to keep the nature center afloat.
Right.
And so a lot of my great nature experiences were on these eco tours, showing other people enjoying other people getting
Excited.
One of my stories, there was this one guy that went on several of my nature tours, and he was a hyperactive adult. Wonderful guy. I mean, you know, give you the shirt off his back kind of guy, you know. And a wonderful, wonderful guy. And we went we were an eco tour at Yellowstone, and we were floating the Snake River. And, you know, there's a lot of bald eagles along the Snake River, and he wanted to see a bald eagle. And he had this video camera, you know, a VHS video camera. You know, he was videoing
on the river.
On the river,
with
whole
full-size VHS tapes.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh!
Well, I mean, it was in a big raft. You know, he wasn't going to dunk his camera, and so floating down the river, he's got his camera. Bald eagle comes out of a tree right in front of his raft, hits the water, grabs a fish, flies up into a tree.
On film?
Yeah, he got.
Oh wow!
He got the whole thing on his video, and you know, so the float trip's over. I was not in his raft. I was in it. There was two rafts, and I was in the other raft. You know, but you know, we knew that he'd gotten this, and I mean, he was just, you know, over the moon, and we got out, and we were, you know, the outfitter, you know, we got out of the rafts, and we were walking back to our vehicles. And he comes up and he puts his arm around my shoulder. There's tears running down his cheeks. Literally, there's tears running down his cheeks. You know, he was so moved by that experience, which, you know, is a cool experience, even for an experienced naturalist to actually get to witness an eagle catching a fish. I mean, that's pretty cool.
But that just adds that a whole other layer.
Yeah.
And you had a role in making that happen.
Yeah. And that you know, that stands out as a really great experience.
Yeah. So on the eco tours you went, you know, is there one place that you took an eco tour to where you would say, if anyone's going to go somewhere to experience nature, they should go to that spot?
I would say the Galapagos Islands.
Okay.
I was there 3 times with
Wow.
eco tours, and it's not on the way to anywhere else. And I would say, you know, put on your bucket list a long trip to the Galapagos, not you know where you.
Not a 3-dayer?
Not a 3-dayer, no. No, if you can get a week or 10 days, where you go to several islands and snorkel a lot. The Galapagos, you know, it's got cool water there, so it's not coral reefs, but it's so volcanic, it has the same structure as coral reefs. You know, kind of the same physical structure in the substrate under the water, but the cool water, highly oxygenated, nutrient-rich, cool water supports huge populations of fish, and then the birds follow that, and the wildlife in the Galapagos, they didn't evolve with humans.
Right.
And so the humans don't really mean anything to them. So you walk right up to it. So that's an incredible place. Of course, Yellowstone is, you know, there's no place like the greater Yellowstone ecosystem.
Right.
There's, I mean, definitely, you know, I can't say enough about that.
Yeah, just beyond the wolves and the grizzlies, and there's all the thermal.
Yeah. The geology and the wildlife is like no place.
Right.
And so I would say those places.
All right, so I've been to Yellowstone, but now I need to go to the Galapagos.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe Steve and I can go record there.
Yeah. Yeah.
That would be great. All right, and just the last question I want to ask, were there any naturalists, environmentalists, books, anything that you would say were, your inspirations for this life that you've led? Or even along the way that, you think, if someone has a passion for nature, they need to read this book or look into this person. Or
Boy, that's tough. One book that had a great impact. You got to look at when I did my biology education. Everett O. Wilson was just developing the theory of island biogeography,
right.
and so that wasn't in my formal education, and I learned that later, because it obviously came to dominate the thinking in conservation biology,
Right.
was the theory of island biogeography, and it was, many years later, a book by David Quammen called "The Song of the Dodo." The Song of the Dodo, and I would recommend it's a terrific book if you like nature, and it's a little dated. I mean,
Sure.
The theory has advanced since Quammen wrote it, but it's a fabulous travel log. It's a great history of conservation biology, and at the same time gives you, a really solid background. So I would really recommend Quammen's book, Song of the Dodo,
Okay.
and then any books by him.
He's a great writer. I'm rereading right now Wild Thoughts from Wild Places.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, he is great.
I'd forgotten what a great writer he is.
Of non-technical books for a naturalist, I actually found the Yule Gibbons books on, stalking the wild asparagus.
Right.
I found those to be great. They were kind of fun, especially with my botanical orientation. They were kind of fun, and because in his recipes for eating wild stuff, he also has a lot of folklore in there.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of it's probably pretty bogus, but
It's fun to read.
it's fun to read, and for someone, if someone was becoming an interpretive naturalist and going to be leading nature walks and that sort of thing,
Great background.
I think those would be a great background.
And that's a whole series.
Yeah, there's a whole series,
Yeah.
The Healthful Herbs, and anyway, those were great.
Have you heard the story that circulates that Yule Gibbons died from eating something he shouldn't have? I've had several people tell me that when I bring up his name, and I've actually looked it up, and no, that's not what he did.
Yeah, I was about to say I don't think so.
No.
But he did die of something that.
Something natural.
Yeah, something natural, but not from doing his recipes.
Not from his wild edibles, yeah.
So I found those to be great. Field guides. I've certainly got my share of field guides.
Sure.
And
So in the great debate in the wildflower guides, are you a Peterson or a Newcombs?
I've got both.
Okay.
And I tend to go. I use Peterson before Newcombs, but I'm not 100% satisfied with either.
Right.
But both have the advantage of being illustrations and not photographs.
Right. So you're an illustration man.
Absolutely.
I agree.
An artist can depict the ideal way, way better than what a photograph can.
Sure. I agree.
So, a good field guide artist is always, in my opinion, superior to photographs.
All right. There you go.
So that would be my recommendation. Okay. Boy, there's been so many books on natural science I've read over the years.
Right.
And I would say don't neglect magazine articles and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
On the natural world, because usually, from reputable sources.
That is true. Yes.
There's good information in those.
Sure. Now, do you subscribe, say, to any natural history journals, or no, not really?
I don't subscribe to any technical journals.
Yeah. Okay.
Not any technical anymore, but I'm a member of like every nature advocacy organization.
Sure. And a lot of them have magazines.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't read those too carefully, because I mean not to put them down, but the the natural history information in there
Sure.
is usually not news to me. So once in a while, something will catch that. But if you just have a good passion, an amateur passion for nature, a lot of those are great.
Right.
You just try not to get bogged down in their advocacy. Not that advocacy isn't important, but that can be so depressing.
It can. It really can. Yeah.
And that was something we did in Wild Ideas. Is with all the environmental problems out there, we made a conscious decision not to let it drift into gloom and doom over environmental stuff. I mean, we would comment, and occasionally and mention when there were concerns or anything, but that wasn't the focus of the podcast to dwell on that.
No, I never felt depressed after listening to it. I felt inspired to go out and.
It was all we always we wanted to inspire people to love nature through the podcast.
Well, you did. So let me say on behalf of everyone, thank you for doing that.
Okay. Well, if for $20 you can get all those episodes on a flash drive, gee, flash drives used to cost more than $20.
So you don't have all the episodes?
No, Joann has them.
Okay.
She has them all.
Right.
And I may have to go give them my $20 and get a flash drive of all the episodes.
I hope they would give that to you for free.
Yeah. Well, a big donor should call up the Wilderness Center and say, underwrite putting them back up all back up on iTunes.
Yeah.
That'd be a great thing. So for it to keep going. I miss doing the podcast in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And so I'm glad you picked up the mantle.
Well, if we're down here again in Ohio, would you be willing to come along and record something with us maybe?
You bet.
All right, that'd be great.
You bet.
Well, thanks again for doing this. On behalf of Steve, I want to just say thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I'm always happy to talk about nature and share it with others.
And parents, you want to say it?
Get those kids outside. Let them play. Get muddy, get wet, get dirty. Enjoy nature.
All right, so we hope you enjoyed Bill's conversation with Gordon Maupin. As always, links to Wild Ideas, the podcast, and every other linkable thing they mentioned in the episode notes. All right, but let's switch back to the good mic. Oh yeah, that's better. So first and foremost, we'd like to thank our growing list of Patreon supporters. So thank you, Vicky Brown. We're thankful for every single patron, but at the end of every show, we give a special shout out to our top patrons. Rob, we named the dog Indy, Nick, and especially Ken, Diane, Morgan, Alyssa, Mountain Misery Farms, Elizabeth, Daniel, and Susan. Thank you all so much. We also want to thank our new 5-star reviewers. So thank you, Camilliace. I think. I'm so bad at family names. So keep those reviews coming, guys. It really helps us get the word out to more people. So if you have any of your own questions, comments, or episode suggestions, send us an email at thefieldguides@gmail.com. Visit us on Instagram at Field Guides Podcast, follow us on Twitter at Field Guides Pod, like and follow us on Facebook, and visit our website at thefieldguidespodcast.com. If you like what you hear and you want to support the podcast, you can do so on patreon.com/thefieldguides. But if you're like me and you can't afford to financially support a podcast right now, there are other ways you can help. You can share our episode with friends or rate us and leave a review on iTunes or Stitcher. It really helps us get the word out to more people. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon for our next regularly scheduled episode.
Hope we won't bore people too much.
No.